Hey guys, how's it going? So, do you know how I said that I enjoy making videos about ancient Greece and Rome more than I do about Christian apologetics? Apparently, that was a lie, because today we are going to be looking at some Christian apologetics content. Um, and I now just realized that almost everything that you can see in this on the screen is from IKEA. Like the glass, the chair, the plush cactus, the bookshelf, including the books, right? Like these are not real books. These are the fake books that they have in IKEA. I just grab a bunch of them and I run. But seriously though, so there's a guy called Erik Manning who has a YouTube channel called Testify. We've already looked at some of his videos in the past, and what prompted me to stream today is that a different YouTuber whose name is Heads Off. Uh, his first name is Ben, but I don't know who he is. Responded to Erik Manning's video, and I liked it, and I thought there are some interesting things that I could add that he didn't. There are some things that he didn't make. Some points that he didn't make. A link to both of those videos, so Eric's original video and the response, are in the video description below. What is it about? Well, Eric is trying to argue for the Gospel of John being eyewitness testimony. He thinks specifically that the author of the Gospel of John is John, son of Zebedee, and I guess he thinks that the entire Gospel as we have it today was written by a single author. Which both of those positions, as I understand, are not in fashion in New Testament scholarship, because not only people don't think that it was written by John, son of Zebedee, even people who think it's written by an eyewitness have different ideas about who wrote it. But they also recognize that the text that we have today is actually a reduction of several different sources. The last chapter is probably added later. One of the sources is the so-called seven sign source, seven sign gospel, right? But Eric thinks that actually the author of the Gospel of John was John, son of Zebedee, and he mentions several pieces of evidence. He makes several arguments for why I think that. And what Ben essentially did in his response was to show why those reasons don't work. I'm not going to play those videos because that's just not my style, and it's not that important. I'm just going to summarize the main pieces of evidence and how Ben responded to them, and I'm going to make some original points. So one piece of evidence in favor of the Gospel of John being eyewitness testimony is the fact that the Gospel of John mentions names often. For example, it's the only Gospel that mentions Nicodemus. It's the only Gospel that mentions Lazarus by name. It's the only Gospel that mentions Malchus. That's the servant who got his ear cut off in the Garden of Gethsemane. And of course, Ben correctly points out that this is not actually evidence of eyewitness testimony, because this is common in other sources, for example, in apocryphal sources. So in apocryphal sources that nobody takes seriously as eyewitness testimony, because, for example, they are very, very late, people who are not named in the canonical Gospels suddenly start getting names. For example, the two criminals that are crucified next to Jesus are named. And there are actually different pairs of names depending on which tradition you read. I'm sure there is a way how to harmonize it, just like there is a way how to harmonize different names on the different lists of the 12 apostles in different sources. You can, for example, say that they had two names, actually, like each had two names, and it just happens to be the case. And one of the apocryphal sources mentions one name, and the other one mentions another name. The centurion of the guard stationed at the tomb of Jesus is named in the Gospel of Peter. His name is Petronius, in case you were interested. And of course, the Magi who visit Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew are named. Not only are there three Magi, which is not specified in the Gospel of Matthew, that was just assumed in later tradition because they bring him 3 different gifts. So of course there must be one person per gift. That makes sense. That's just how you do ancient historiography, right? But they also have names. In Czech, it's Pankrác, Servác, and Bonifác. And so this is not evidence of eyewitness testimony because we actually find it even in sources that we don't think are eyewitness sources. So it's a literary feature that doesn't discriminate. It doesn't distinguish between an eyewitness and not non-eyewitness based text. It's just this kind of literary feature appears in both. So it's just not an indication of either. And this isn't surprising given that stories which expand on existing stories, existing narratives, usually do it by filling gaps or holes in the stories that they expand upon, right? They usually expand on what was only hinted at in the original story. And this is true about current popular culture as well. Let's see if you know what this is. Who knows what this is? I don't think it's very difficult. This is a prop which was built for Star Wars. And when I say Star Wars, I mean the original Star Wars, before it was called Episode 4 or whatever, before it was called A New Hope, the movie by George Lucas in the 70s. And this is just a prop that some people built for the movie. It's featured on the Death Star, and it doesn't do anything. It's just rides around the corridors, Death Star corridors, and there is one interaction with the characters in the movie because one of those robots is scared away by Chewbacca, and it just like drives away. Fast forward about 40 years later, and you can read a Wikipedia article about it, and it's just have everything. Now it has a name. You can read who built it, or what's the specific factory, the specific company that produces them, on what planet. You can read how much it costs. Of course, none of that information existed in the context of the original movie. This is just people expanding on that source material. And this is very similar to how it worked in the ancient world. For example, let's take Homer, right? Like the earliest Greek piece of writing that we have. If you don't, the earliest Greek literature, right? We have Greek writing from the Bronze Ages, but that's not literature. Homer wrote or edited or composed or put together roughly what we have as the Iliad and the Odyssey. And interestingly enough, they don't really cover much of the events. The Iliad takes place over only 51 days in the last year of the Trojan War, which goes on for 10 years. The Odyssey only covers about 41 days. So naturally, people after Homer expanded on that story, and they expanded by adding, like, filling the gaps and adding different narratives around it. And there is actually a body of literature which survives in fragments. It's epic poetry, so it's the same genre of as Homer. None of these epics were unfortunately preserved, but in some cases we have plot summaries essentially, and in other cases we have fragments. It's called the Homeric cycle or Kyklos. And it's really interesting to observe how the different stories are composed around the Trojan War. So one of them, for example, is Cypria, which is a prequel. It just narrates the events leading up to the Trojan War. It was written later, but it fills the gap of what happened before the Trojan War. What are the events that actually led up to it? So in case of Star Wars, this would be the Clone Wars, right? Then there are other epics. One of them is called the Little Iliad. The other one is called Eleupersis. And those are essentially sequels to the Iliad. They talk about the building of the horse, the Trojan horse, and about the actual destruction of Troy. and also about the death of Achilles, which is not narrated in the Iliad. And another example is Telegonia, which is like a spin-off of the Odyssey. So if the Odyssey was France, then Telegonia would be. Well, that's actually not a good example, not a good analogy. But basically, Telegonia is the story of Odysseus' son Telegonos, who is not mentioned in the Odyssey. He is invented, and the epic tells the story of his story. Right? He was the son of Kirke. So when Odysseus stayed with Kirke, they apparently had a son that Odyssey somehow forgot to mention, and Telegonia just tells what happened to him. But again, this was invented later, and this is a new character. So of course, when you have fiction working like this, you are going to generate new narratives, and with the narratives, you are going to generate names. You are going to see additions of names of existing unnamed characters in the existing narratives, and of course, you are going to see names of new characters. And by the way, there is also an undesigned coincidence in Kypria. So, as you may know, undesigned coincidences are the craze in resurrection apologetics, right? It's one of the talking points that are supposed to be evidence for historical reliability of the Gospels. There are various definitions of what exactly an undesigned coincidence is, and different sources have different lists of what counts as an undesigned coincidence. But one of the most frequent definitions, and one of the most exciting kinds of one of the most exciting ways how to define what an undesigned coincidence is basically like a literary feature when a text answers a question that naturally arises by a different text. So the two texts then fit together like a hand and a glove. And of course, we have undesigned coincidences. So it's a concept that's problematic. But if you just grant for the sake of argument that that's a thing, that's of course not evidence for anything, because once you start thinking about narratives in these kinds of terms, it becomes trivially easy to start noticing them even in fictional texts. And they, of course, exist in this Homeric cycle, in the epic cycle. For example, the beginning of Kypria. So what the Iliad and the Odyssey don't answer is why exactly the Trojan War takes place. They describe some of the events that lead up to it. For example, the trial or the judgment of Paris. But one thing that's very peculiar about the Homeric epics is that different gods take different sides in the war. And it makes sense, like what their allegiances are. For example, Aphrodite is on the side of the Trojans. Athena is on the side of the Greeks. But one god who is kind of neutral, who is above the whole war, is of course Zeus. He might help one side or the other depending on the situation, but he's really neutral. And there is this famous imagery in the Homeric epics, in the Iliad, of Zeus kind of overseeing the battlefield, and he's holding scales. And the scales move up, like the different sides of the scales move up and down depending on how the individual side is doing. And what's really, really interesting is that apparently the scales do it on their own, and Zeus doesn't actually do anything to influence it, right? Which just signifies that he's kind of neutral, and he's ultimately in control of the situation because he's the one holding the scales. So naturally, a question arises: what is his plan? Like, what is his end game? Why is it the case that the Trojan War is actually taking place? And Kypria is giving us the answer. So this is the glove that fits the hand, right? It says, there was a time when the countless tribes of men thought wide dispersed, oppressed the surface of the deep-bosomed earth. And Zeus saw it and had pity, and in his wise heart resolved to relieve the all-nurturing earth of men by causing the great struggle of the Ilian War, that the load of death might empty the world. And so the heroes were slain in Troy, and the plan of Zeus came to pass. This is information that you don't find in the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's only found in Cypria. And if you think about it as a Christian apologist, this is an amazing undesigned coincidence, right? Because the text answers a question that naturally arises when you read the Homeric epics. But when you just think about it as a normal person, it's just obvious, like, why these additional details are included. Well, because people are filling in the gaps, right? They are just plugging the holes, and they are creating new narratives around the existing ones. So in this case, the reason for the Trojan War is essentially the depopulation conspiracy theory, right? The Trojan War was manufactured by Zeus because of overpopulation. So the solution was to start a war where a lot of people would be killed, and that would solve the problem, right? And that's of course like anthropomorphized because Gaia is a goddess, so she's simultaneously the surface of the world, but she's also a person. So if there's too much people on the surface of the earth, she is personally being overburdened, and she needs to shake that weight down, essentially. Okay, so that's one piece of evidence that Erik offers in favor of the Gospel of John being eyewitness testimony. The second piece of evidence is the fact that the Gospel of John often mentions precise numbers, often for apparently no reason, right? And of course, Ben shows that some of them might have been taken from some of the sources behind the Gospel of John, and I think in some cases that's pretty much clear, right? And also they might be included to give the text the sense of verisimilitude. And another thing that I think everyone immediately can think of is the idea that the numbers have some kind of symbolic significance. And traditionally, they were also interpreted significantly, for example, by Origin. So it could be the case that they were originally intended, no pun intended, right? Originally, symbolically by the author. So that's the second line of evidence. And the last, third line of evidence is the idea that the Gospel of John includes a lot of vivid details. And of course, Ben again shows that vivid details also appear in apocryphal sources. And one passage that he cites is Acts of Thomas. I'm not going to reiterate it here. As I mentioned, both videos, the original one and the response, are in the video description below. Smash that like button. And so some of the examples are also explainable by the Gospel of John drawing from the Hebrew Bible, right? So for example, only in the Gospel of John, in the miraculous multiplication of food passage, it says that the bread was a barley bread. Why? Well, because the account is probably based, I would say almost certainly based, on multiplication of food in 2 Kings. In the Gospel of John, and only in the Gospel of John, Jesus is wearing a seamless tunic. Why is it the case? Well, the idea is that the author of the Gospel of John misunderstood poetic parallelism in Psalm 22, which is the passage that he appeals to in this section of the Gospel. The relevant passage is, they divided my clothes amongst themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. So what's actually going on is that in ancient Hebrew poetry, in ancient Hebrew poetic texts, including Psalms, one of the metric impulses, actually one of the ways how you can recognize that this is meant to be poetic in the first place, is so-called poetic parallelism. And it's the idea that there are two different segments of the verse, and the same information is essentially repeated twice in slightly different words, but it's the same thing. Once in the first segment of the verse, and again in the second segment of the verse. It's either the same information, just repeated with slightly different words, or in the second segment of the verse, the same information is developed a little bit. So some famous examples of poetic parallelism from Psalms include, for example, praise him, all his angels, praise him, all his host. So in this case, it's the same information, and angels are synonymous to the host, the heavenly host, right? Another example, the Lord's own portion was his people, Jacob his allotted share. So in this case, God's people is identical to Jacob because the two parts of the verse just repeat the same information. So in Psalm 22, when it says, they divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots, this is again poetic parallelism. So it's the same information, just repeated twice, because the casting of the lots was the method of division, the way how the people in the psalm divide the clothing is by casting lots about it. But the author of the Gospel of John didn't understand that. So in the Gospel of John, when the soldiers are dividing Jesus' clothing, they divided all the pieces of clothing among themselves. But then the author of the Gospel of John thinks, and he wonders, but if they divided them, why would they also cast lots? Because he doesn't understand it's the same action, right? So he says, aha, it must be because his tunic was seamless and they didn't want to tear it. So they divided all of his other clothes, but for the tunic, they casted lots, and the person who won got the tunic. So this is why it says, this is why the narrative is structured this way, right? Okay, so these are the three pieces of evidence that Erik presented, and these are the responses that Ben gave. So what do I think about it? Why am I streaming about it, right? It's like, what is it that is my original contribution? Awkward silence. I think there is one point which Ben didn't make, and I think it's kind of important. So that's why I decided it's worth mentioning it instead of talking about Greek and Roman history. So Erik says that the Gospel of John mentions names more often. He says that it mentions numbers more often. And he also says that it mentions vivid details more often. And I think the 1 million pine point question is more often than what? And the answer is more often than the synoptics, right? So let's just grant for the sake of argument that frequently mentioning names, frequently mentioning numbers, and frequently mentioning vivid details really are markers of eyewitness testimony. Let's just grant that. Well, if Erik thinks that the Gospel of John having a lot of these markers counts as evidence of the Gospel of John being eyewitness testimony, does he also think that the synoptics having less of these markers counts as evidence of the synoptics not being eyewitness testimony? I think that's a really good question. For example, the Gospel of Mark never mentions the name of the high priest. Does that count as evidence against the Gospel of Mark being eyewitness testimony? Because I can think of a really good explanation for why it never mentions it. And it's the fact that the author didn't know about it. Because he actually didn't have any eyewitness sources. It's not the case that it was written by Mark, who was an interpreter of Peter, right? So why would Erik agree with that? Or does he think that the Gospel of Mark is still eyewitness testimony despite the fact that it never mentions that name? Because if he thinks that, then I think he's just having it both ways, right? Like he wants to have his cake and eat it too. He says that the Gospel of John is eyewitness testimony because it contains a lot of markers of eyewitness testimony. But don't worry, the synoptics are eyewitness testimony still, even though they don't contain that much markers. So that's basically the point. And I think this illustrates a difference between a truth seeker and an apologist. Between someone who is really interested in discovering what the truth is, and someone who is interested in defending what they believe, what they already believe is true, essentially. So say that we are truth seekers, right? And we are interested in discovering which gospels are eyewitness testimony. How would we go about it? Well, I think what a truth seeker would do is to split all the extant gospels, which is about 40, by the way, if you include all of the various fragments, into two groups: suspected eyewitness gospels and suspected non-eyewitness gospels, and see what the gospels in each group have in common and how the two groups are different. And that would actually tell you what the markers of eyewitness testimony are. And it's not adding names or vivid details, because that actually, as was demonstrated by Ben, occurs in both groups. So that's, I think, how you would go about it, right? That would be your research proposal. But that's not what Erik does, because Erik is an apologist. He is interested in defending the idea that the Gospel of John is eyewitness testimony, because he can then demand that non-Christians explain to him how it is possible that entire groups of people were convinced that they experienced having breakfast with Jesus, which is, of course, what is narrated in the last chapter of the Gospel of John. And then he can say that the most probable explanation for why there were people who experienced that is that Jesus was actually raised from the dead and his religion is true. He's not fooling anyone. Like, everyone understands that this is his end goal. This is his end game. So he's trigger happy about providing reasons for the Gospel of John being eyewitness testimony, and he never stops and thinks about what the broader implications of what he's saying are, which is something that I think a truth seeker would actually do. And the broader implications are, namely, that he has a group of 4 gospels. He thinks all of them are eyewitness testimony, but one of them has abundance of the markers of eyewitness testimony, and the other 3 don't. So this is why I think that he's essentially shot himself in the foot, right? Because he thinks that he's providing reasons for why the Gospel of John is eyewitness testimony. But what he's actually doing is shining a spotlight on a literary feature of the canonical Gospels, which I think his hypothesis of them being eyewitness testimony cannot explain. And this literary feature is this, essentially. All 4 canonical Gospels are eyewitness testimony. They were either written by eyewitnesses or they were sourced by eyewitnesses. But the markers of the eyewitness testimony that Erik mentions all accumulate in only one of them, in the Gospel of John. Why is that? What explains that? Is that what we would expect to see if all 4 Gospels were in fact eyewitness testimony? Or would we expect to see these markers distributed more evenly, I would say even randomly, between the 4 Gospels? Because after all, they are all eyewitness testimony, not just the one, right? I think that's the case. We wouldn't expect them to cluster so heavily in only this one. And I think this is where Erik's line of reasoning backfires, because he thinks that he's providing a powerful cumulative case for the Gospel of John being eyewitness testimony. I think he's very happy about the fact that he can name not just 1 or 2, but actually multiple different lines of evidence that point to the Gospel of John being eyewitness testimony. But this accumulation of markers in only one of the 4 supposedly eyewitness gospels actually becomes inexplicable on his hypothesis. So his cumulative case actually backfires. Because the hypothesis that all 4 gospels are eyewitness testimony doesn't explain it. There is no content in it that has the explanatory power to account for this literary feature. And the literary feature is the fact that all of the markers just accumulate in the Gospel of John, right? Much more heavily than in the synoptics, even though they are all supposedly eyewitness testimony. So what can Erik say to that? He can either say that it's just a brute fact, or that we don't know, but it's just not explaining it. Or he could invoke some additional auxiliary ad hoc hypothesis. Can we think of some? I think we can. He could say that maybe John, the son of Zebedee, remembered numbers more often than, for example, Matthew, even though they were both eyewitnesses to pretty much the same events. Because John was on the spectrum, and people with autism are just more about numbers. Like, that's a nice hypothesis, right? Of course, completely ad hoc, but that can explain it. But that's it's just me joking. And I think this is really a powerful objection because, unlike Erik, I think I can actually explain this literary feature. I can explain why is it the case that the things that are supposedly markers of eyewitness testimony actually cluster specifically in the Gospel of John, right? So if we propose that the canonical Gospels are not eyewitness testimony, that they were actually not written by eyewitnesses, and that they don't have eyewitness sources, and that what Erik thinks are the markers of eyewitness testimony actually are not markers of eyewitness testimony, then we can provide principled reasons why these features cluster so heavily, particularly in the Gospel of John, right? Less often than in the synoptics. So something that is inexplicable on the hypothesis that this is eyewitness testimony now becomes explainable. So let's try and provide some of those explanations. Why is it the case that the Gospel of John in particular, as opposed to the synoptics, mentions specific numbers so often and not one of the synoptics? What explains that? Well, the Gospel of John has been very often described as being Gnosticism or Gnostic adjacent. It's the specific relationship between Gnosticism, what that even means, and the Gospel of John is complicated. And different scholars have proposed different ideas. Some call it Gnostic, some call it proto-Gnostic, some call it anti-Gnostic, some call it within Gnostic milieu. Like Rudolf Bultmann famously believed that the Gospel of John is, as we have it today, is an anti-Gnostic reduction of what was originally a Gnostic text. Raymond Brown later in 70s thought that Gnosticism, what became Gnosticism, was originally a splinter group from the Johannine community. So there's like a genetic link, right? John Turner, for example, thought that Gnosticism and the Johannine community came from the same religious background. So it's not like a splinter; it's like a Y shape. Finn Perkins, for example, thought that Gnostics and the Johannine community were independent, but they just independently developed the same oral traditions, which the synoptics don't develop. So there wasn't a common ground or common religious background. They were just in parallel developing the same traditions. And of course, Michael Williams, very famously, that's a very influential publication, argued that the term Gnosticism itself is like an invalid category, and because first of all, it's anachronistic. The people in the ancient world who call themselves Gnostics, we don't actually count as Gnostics today. And the people that we call Gnostics didn't call themselves that. That's one objection, which I don't think is fatal. But the second objection is much more serious. and that's the fact that various supposedly defining features, defining characteristics of what Gnosticism is are not found in many of the texts that are traditionally identified as Gnostics. I don't think this is like a fatal objection, because what I think an issue is that scholars sometimes view ancient religious ideas kind of similar to religions as they exist today, right? So today, religions and religious denominations are relatively clearly distinct from each other. And they are like boxes, right? With sharp boundaries that you can put a label on. So there is, for example, a box of Christianity, then there is a box of Islam, then there are boxes like Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, and stuff like that. But I suspect that religious movements such as Gnosticism were in fact not like that. And they were much more similar to alternative spirituality today. They were much more similar in a way to things like New Age, esoterica, woo, and these kinds of things, right? Because that's alternative spirituality. How were they similar? Well, New Age is very eclectic. It's basically a mishmash of different concepts like energies, chakras, crystals, quantum woo, reincarnation, astrology, numerology, and these kinds of things. It's usually not systematic. It's very loosely connected. There are no like rigid schools or denominations. There are no systematic theologies in New Age, right? And individual practitioners usually have like mutually contradictory views, or even internally incoherent views. But what makes them all fit under the umbrella of New Age are the concepts that they work with, like energies and chakras, right? So when we hear someone talk and use these concepts, we tend to classify it as New Age. And we are not concerned with this systemic level coherence of the whole structure, right? Because it's not important. And I think this is kind of similar to this alternative ancient spirituality. There was a lot of different streams of religious thought in the ancient world. Some of it Greek, some of it Greco-Jewish, some of it Jewish, which covered, like some of it has labels, right? Pythagoreanism, Orphism, Gnosticism, and that was like an alternative spirituality in the ancient world. Alternative to what? Alternative to the national and polis religions, including the cult of Yahweh in the Jerusalem temple, and including imperial cults of the Hellenistic kingdoms and later Rome. So I think when scholars think of these ancient religious movements in terms of clearly defined boxes, they are then more likely to dismiss common cultural background, genetic ties, or influences, because what they observe in the texts doesn't precisely fit into these boxes, right? So they basically throw the baby out with the bathwater. 2,000 years from now, it's possible that historians and people in religious studies are going to make the same mistake, and they are going to reject ideas of the same cultural background, genetic links, and influences between different New Age texts, essentially, which will be preserved for similar reasons, because they will fail to understand that New Age today, just like these alternative ancient religious movements, were much more fluid, and they don't fit into these neat boxes, right? And I think one concept that would be really useful to push in this space is like a religious landscape. If you think of a landscape is not divided into distinct regions. It's not like tiles in the civilization game, right? where you have sharp boundaries between these hexes that represent like deserts or settlers of Catan, right? In reality, you don't see sharp boundaries between forests, deserts, and stuff like that. Or it's not the case that the landscape is divided into different biomes like Minecraft, right? Where the boundaries are also relatively sharp. Instead, there are different regions there are different parts of the landscape which are more typical examples of certain biomes. There is something that when you see a picture of it, you immediately recognize it as a jungle. There are pictures or different pictures that when you see it, you immediately recognize that it's a picture of a desert, right? But these biomes, in reality, in like real landscapes, actually gradually blend together. And I think similarly, in both New Age spirituality and in alternative religious movements, including Gnosticism, there are various motifs, ideas, and so on, which are more or less distant in this religious landscape. And there are some regions of this religious landscape that represent like clearer manifestations of various sets of ideas than others. But just like is the case in the landscape, there are no sharp distinctions, and the boundaries are like very fuzzy and vague, right? So that's just like my rant about Gnosticism and how that term is being used. That's why I say that's why I don't say that the Gospel of John is Gnostic or proto-Gnostic or anti-Gnostic. Uh, what I want to say is that out of the four canonical Gospels, it's the one that is the most Gnostic adjacent. That would be like the closest to what could be defined as Gnosticism in this hypothetical religious landscape. And I think this, like whatever you think about the Gospel of John or Gnosticism, I think this is undeniable. And if someone wants to deny it, I would like them to show me how the Synoptic Gospels are, for example, closer, how they are more Gnostic adjacent than the Gospel of John. Right? So, what does this have to do with what we are talking about? Well, I think that this adjacency to Gnosticism is what explains numbers, like why the Gospel of John specifically, as opposed to some of the synoptics, mentions specific numbers the most often, because numbers and numeric symbolism is, of course, very important in the various texts that are labeled as Gnostic. And we have some examples. This is the epistle of Augustus, which is one of the texts which was discovered in the Nag Hammadi library. I just highlighted all of the numbers. As you can see, that's a lot. For example, in Gnostic cosmologies, apparently it was very important. What is the number of heavenly spheres? What is the number of various divine beings in those heavenly spheres? And so on. There were Gnostic groups which actually developed their own systems of numerology based on Greek letters, based on the letters of the Greek alphabet. It was a bit similar to Hebrew Kabbalah. This is an excerpt from Irenaeus' Against Heresies, where he talks about a guy named Marcus of Lyons, who apparently lived in the 2nd century. Irenaeus says that he was a disciple of Valentinus, who was in turn a disciple of Theudas, who was a disciple of Paul. So he would be like a 4th generation Christian, essentially, in the 2nd century. And Irenaeus gives a summary of what the theology was. And again, I just highlighted all of the numbers, right? So Ogdoad is just like an 8th, Decad is 10, Tetrad is, of course, 4, Hectad is 6, Duodecad is 12. Alpha and Omega are actually also numbers, because that was pretty standard that in ancient alphabets, they didn't have like a specific character set for numerals. They just use numbers, they just use letters for numbers, right? Roman numbers, for example. And in the Greek-speaking world, Greek letters were used as numbers, for numbers. So again, as you can see, very, very important. The only difference between something like this and the Gospel of John is that the Gospel of John would be a historiographical application of this kind of thinking in terms of numbers. Here we had cosmology, but in the and theology, like a speculative theology, but in the Gospel of John, that would be applied to historiography, the genre of the historiography, but the same basic idea. So that can cover, it can explain why is it the case that specifically the Gospel of John includes numbers more often as opposed to the synoptics. But we can also ask the question, why is it the case that the Gospel of John in particular, as opposed to some of the synoptics, for example, includes vivid details more often? Well, again, the Gospel of John specifically was very often described as the most Greek gospel in terms of both content and form. It's the most Greek gospel in content in terms of form for various reasons. For example, in the synoptics, Jesus teaches primarily in parables. Parables are used very often, for example, in later rabbinical teachings, but you don't really see something comparable in the Greek thought. Something that comes probably closest to it are Aesop's fables, or fables in general. That was a particular type of narrative which had a similar structure, and it also performed some of the same functions. For example, it was very often ethical in nature. It was supposed to teach people something about how to behave. But there are no parables in the Gospel of John, right? So unlike synoptics, the Gospel of John doesn't actually have any parables. Instead, it has very long discourses and dialogues that nobody thinks are actually historical. Everyone recognizes that this was invented by the author of the Gospel because that's what ancient authors did. Even if they had a pretty good idea about what the person in question might have said, unless they had an actual recorded text of the speech, they composed what, as Thucydides says, was appropriate for the occasion, what they believed to be appropriate for the occasion. So it was perfectly fine for the author of the Gospel of John to invent speeches because he invented what he believed was appropriate for Jesus to say. And of course, if he himself was incorrect about what Jesus said, then he was incorrect about what was plausible for Jesus to say. So in the Gospel of John, we have these long discourses, but we don't have anything like that in the synoptics, right? In the synoptics, we have just pithy sayings, usually stringed together loosely, with some usually fairly minimal narrative context. For example, in the Gospel of Luke. So the way how these long speeches and discourses are structured is much more similar to Greek rhetoric and Greek dialogues. The longest discourse is the so-called farewell speech in John 13 to 17, where Jesus is just talking basically uninterrupted for several chapters. You're probably not going to be able to see it, but I color-coded it. Everything in red is Jesus' direct speech. You don't have anything like that, even remotely like that, in any of the synoptics. And it was described as one of the most Greek, or as the most Greek canonical gospel in terms of content. For example, in the Gospel of John, Jesus doesn't proclaim the coming kingdom of God. In the synoptics, it's all over the synoptics, right? What is the first thing that Jesus says in the Gospel of Mark? In the earliest surviving gospel, he says, the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe the Gospels. Apparently, the kingdom of God is not at hand in the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John makes references to the Hebrew Bible the least often out of the four, 5 times less than the Gospel of Matthew, which I think is significant. And then there are some like smaller features. For example, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is not tested by Satan in the wilderness. In the Gospel of John, interestingly enough, Jesus is never actually put on trial before the Sanhedrin Council, the Jewish council. And then there are, of course, all of the concepts that we find in the Gospel of John, like Logos, who is a divine being which pre-existed in incarnation of earth. It's a firstborn son of Yahweh, and he's an agent of creation. Like, where else do we find that? Well, in Philo of Alexandria. Who was a Philo of Alexandria? He was a Jew who became convinced that actually Middle Platonism was already discovered by Moses, and he tried to show that actually the Hebrew Bible teaches what was later co-opted by Plato and what was Middle Platonism of his own day, right? And of course, it was objected, especially after the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the Gospel of John isn't actually the most Greek gospel. It's actually the most Jewish gospel, because it turned out that a lot of the ideas that people in the past, like previous scholars before the discovery, thought are coming from the Greek world, are actually already present in the, or simultaneously, I should say, present in the Qumran community. But I don't really think that this works, because the distinction between the Greek and the Jewish isn't like a sharp distinction, again, between two neatly separated boxes. The Second Temple Jewish environment was already a thoroughly Greek environment. The Second Temple Jews were already Hellenized by the time first century came around, right? So why is this relevant? Why is it relevant that we can characterize in some aspects the Gospel of John as the most Greek gospel? Well, because I think it helps us explain why is it the case that it's the Gospel of John in particular, which includes a lot of vivid details. Because I think, and I think this is a fair characterization, a focus on vivid details, especially vivid visual details, is a very strong and very striking characteristic of specifically ancient Greek literature. And there is there is like a specific term for it. It's called ekphrasis. It can be described not only as a description, textual description of a piece of art, most usually of a painting. So the idea is that you as an author essentially describes in very lively and vivid terms what's painted on a painting. That's ekphrasis. More generally, it can be a vivid description of any piece of art. It could be, for example, a vivid description of a sculpture, but it can just be a very vivid description of something in general. For example, of a landscape. And I would argue, and I think there are lots of examples of it, and I think this is pretty non-controversial in like scholarship on Greek literature, that this vivid and lively narration was a particularly strong feature of Greek literature. Not just when it comes to description of art, but for example, technical descriptions. Like when people in the ancient world wanted to describe a machine, they would have to describe it, they would have to describe its individual parts verbally. And there is a reason why ekphrasis existed and why it was so popular. And it's just that pieces of art were very difficult to reproduce because you essentially had to recreate it by hand. If you had a painting and you wanted to copy it, someone just had to basically repaint it. There were, of course, no copying machines, which means that pieces of art were not always available. So ekphrasis was essentially an alternative medium of how people could enjoy the visual sensation of looking at a piece of art, like a painting. So the idea is that if you couldn't afford or just couldn't get a famous piece of painting, what you would do instead, as an affluent Greek, you would buy an ekphrasis of that painting and you would have a slave read it to you, for example, during a symposium. And we have examples of where people in the Greek world are entertained by having these descriptions of various pieces of art read to them. And we even have preserved entire collections of these verbal textual descriptions of pieces of art. So that was one of the reasons why ekphrasis existed. But I would argue it's actually more than that. That for some reason, and there are arguments as to why it is the case, Greeks in particular were especially fond of vivid, detailed description in their literature. And we can give some examples. It all goes actually all the way back to Homer, who, as I mentioned, the Homeric epics are the earliest surviving Greek literary texts. And some scholars think that it's very, very significant that already in these earliest surviving Greek texts, we have examples of very vivid description and very vivid narration, which isn't really paralleled in other types of literature in the ancient world at the time. It's much more pronounced, for example, than in the ancient Near Eastern texts, as far as I understand. One specific literary feature, which features very vivid and lively narration, are the so-called Homeric similes, which again are fairly unparalleled, and where they occur also in the ancient world, they are usually directly tied to Homer. They occur essentially as mimesis of Homer. What's a Homeric simile? It's a specific type of analogy where you start by comparing something, for example, a person or a god, to something else, for example, an animal. But then the analogy kind of gets out of hand, and you are still describing the thing that you are comparing the person to, but you start describing it in terms of things that are no longer applicable to the person that you are comparing it to. So the analogy essentially gets out of hand, right? So you start by saying something that still applies, that's still analogous, but then you drift away from the analogy and you start saying something that's no longer analogous. This is a fairly typical Homeric simile. So this is like a particularly long example. It's actually several of these homilies stitched together in the second book of the Iliad. Just as an all-consuming fire, so this is the thing that's being compared, burns through huge forests on a mountaintop, and men far off can see its light. And again, appreciate how this is vivid and how this is lively and how this paints a mental picture, how it's a very visual description. Just as an all-consuming fire burns through huge forests on a mountaintop, and men far off can see its light, so as soldiers marched out, their glittering bronze blazed through the sky to heaven, an amazing sight. So that's one simile. Another simile immediately follows. As many birds in flight, geese, cranes, and long-necked swans, in an Asian meadow by the flowering river Caistrius, fly here and there, proud of their strong wings, and call as they settle, the meadow resounding with the noise. So the many groups of soldiers moved out then, from ships and huts unto Scamander's plain. Under men's and horses' feet, the earth rang ominously. Then they stood there, in that flowered meadow, by the Scamander, an immense array, as numerous, that's another simile, as leaves and flowers in springtime, like flies swarming around shepherds' pens in spring, when pails fill up with milk. So the Achaeans, I don't actually know what the pronunciation is in English. A huge, long-haired host marched out onto that plain against the Trojans, eager to destroy them. So here we have, I think, 3 or 4 similes. And the point is that already Greek here in second half of the 8th century, Greek poetry, Greek literature is extremely vivid. It's extremely rich in detail. And this is not a coincidental. This is not exceptional. This is typical. One very famous passage in the Homeric epics is the description of Achilles' sheet, of Achilles' shield. Sorry, it's so in at one point in the Iliad, Hephaestus manufactures a new shield for Achilles, and there is a very famous, very long description of the shield because Hephaestus manufactures the shield so that on its surface the entire cosmos is displayed. And there is a very long passage which very vividly and in great detail describes the various segments of the shield. So here's one visual representation, and here are its individual components. It's a passage that has been analyzed to death. It's been interpreted to death. I think probably overinterpreted, but it's nevertheless extremely important because it's a window into archaic, so late Dark Ages Greek worldview and Greek thought. It tells us about how the Greeks thought about the world, its individual components, how they thought about the kind of order that exists in the world, how they divided not just physical world, but also the mental into individual components, what kind of distinctions they draw, what kind of dualisms they saw, and these kinds of things, right? And of course, it became a literary trope. So from then on, every example of epic poetry had to include, every text in the genre of epic poetry had to include at least one description of a shield. It's in the Aeneid by Virgil, for example, but there are other examples as well, right? And just to drive the point home, this is a passage from an ancient novel from the 2nd century CE. So that would be roughly contemporary with the Gospel of John. And it's a beginning of a novel which features a typical ekphrasis. So this is a fairly representative example of what ekphrasis is and how it looks like. So the novel actually opens by the narrator describing a painting which he saw, which puts him and a different character in like a particular frame of mind. The painting was of Europa. The sea depicted was the Phoenician Ocean, the land Sidon. On the land part was a meadow and a troop of girls. In the sea a bull was swimming, and on his back sat a beautiful maiden, borne by the bull towards Crete. The meadow was thick with all kinds of flowers, and among them was planted a thicket of trees and shrubs, the trees growing so close that their foliage touched. Again, very visual, right? And their branches, interweaving their leaves, thus made a kind of continuous roof over the flowers beneath. The artist had also represented the shadows thrown by the leaves, and the sun was gently breaking through, here and there, onto the meadow, where the painter had represented openings in the thick roof of foliage. The meadow was surrounded on all sides by an enclosure and lay wholly within the embowering roof. Beneath the shrubs, grass beds of flowers grew orderly, narcissus, roses, and bays. In the middle of the meadow, in the picture flowed a rivulet of water, bubbling up on one side from the ground, and on the other watering the flowers and shrubs. And a gardener had been painting, holding a pick, stooping over a single channel, and leading a path for the water. And I think the ekphrasis actually continues. And I think if you were told to paint it, you would do a pretty good job, right? Because the point of the paint ekphrasis was to describe the painting so that it actually conjures up the visual sensation of seeing the original work. There are other examples like this in the work, in the novel, which are not ekphrasis of a piece of art, but they are just vivid narration within the narrative, within the actual plot, within the actual story, right? So it's not the case that these kinds of things, like novelistic realism, are only present in modern literature. They were present in ancient literature as well. And they were present specifically in Greek literature. So, just to make a general point about Erik's video, in current Christian apologetics, there are two approaches to the resurrection apologetics, which is like a subset of Christian apologetics. That's the one where you actually start talking about your religion, not just about theism in general. So there are two approaches. There are the minimal facts, championed by people like Mike Lacona and Gary Habermas. And then there are the maximal facts, which are championed by apologists like the McGrews, Jonathan McLatchie, and apparently Erik Manning. And there is some level of animosity between the two. For example, Dia McGrew writes pretty scathing criticisms of Lacona on her blog. And she actually wrote an entire book refuting some of his research. And what's the point of the maximal facts apologetics? Well, it seems to me, by their own admission, that basically a lot of apologists have realized that there are, in fact, pretty good naturalistic explanations of the minimal facts that are supposed to be evidences, like powerful convincing pieces of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So instead of the minimal facts, they go for the maximal facts. And what does it mean? Like what do I mean by that? Well, it means establishing basically that we should trust what the Gospels say, canonical Gospels say, because they accurately report history. And closely connected to that is the idea that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, or they are sourced by eyewitnesses. But the problem is, as we've seen, I think, that the arguments that they put forward for that are extremely weak and they are extremely easily debunkable. I would say they are extremely simplistic and very surface level, and that these apologists almost completely fail to engage with New Testament scholarship. Like at one point, Erik, for example, quotes one of the dilemmas from C.S. Lewis. It's not the famous liar, lunatic, or the Lord trilemma. It's a different one, right? But he just quotes that, like in response to a point. If you do that, shame on you. I think in this context, that's like quoting Ken Ham when you're talking about biology. Or it's like quoting Ray Comfort when you're talking about physics. I think when it comes to New Testament scholarship, what someone like C.S. Lewis has to say is extremely shallow, superficial, and simplistic. It's not the case only for C.S. Lewis. It's the case for other people as well. Like, Erik, do you think that New Testament scholars in the current year, in 2020, have nothing to say in response to C.S. Lewis? Right? Like, do you think that Mark Goodacre, for example, doesn't have anything to say about Lewis's dilemmas? Or do you think that he does, and you're just ignoring that because you are an apologist and you're just looking for something to say and not for what's actually true? Just asking. So basically, the idea is that these kinds of apologists fail to engage with New Testament scholarship and what it has to say about how the Gospels were written, why there is more than one Gospel, right? Like, why wouldn't one Gospel be enough? Why there are similarities between them and the specific kind of similarities that we observe. Why there are differences between them, and I'm just not talking just about apparent contradictions. I'm just talking, why is it the case that the Gospels are different specifically in the ways that they are? And of course, New Testament scholars have recognized that various literary features of the Gospels are more explicable on the view that they are not a product of eyewitness testimony. That's why, that what explains why most New Testament scholars don't hold the view that the Gospels are eyewitness testimony, right? That's why almost no New Testament scholar puts forward positive arguments for Gospels being eyewitness testimony. Like Richard Bauckham is basically unique, and his research so far has failed to convince. And by the way, not even Richard Bauckham thinks that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew. But that's a separate video, which has already been made, by the way. It's on my channel. Right. So this is why, basically, why so few New Testament scholars think that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses or were sourced by eyewitnesses. And by the way, almost all of these New Testament scholars who don't think that are Christians. So this is not a case of an anti-Christian bias. This is just a better explanation. So yeah, that's what I have to say. And now let's look at some questions. Check out Second Maccabees. It shows how Jews were to rid of Israelite customs and adopt Greek customs or be killed. A Second Maccabees is not historically reliable. It's very tendentious historical fiction. Like Second Maccabees, okay, it's a really important source for a specific period of world's history, basically. But that's because it's like one of the only ones, right? Like a lot of the information that we have in First Maccabees, we don't have anywhere else, and it's like relatively good. But yeah, Second Maccabees is just, I would say, historical fiction. All right, so let's wrap it up by talking about something completely different. I have a pretty sweet story from Herodotus, one of the earliest Greek historians. The earliest extant Greek historian, of course, and it features necromancy and necrophilia. So all of your favorite things, right? And it's about Periandros, the second tyrant of Corinth. And it's a story about how he killed his wife. He had sex with her corpse. He buried her naked, but then he realized that apparently he forgot to ask her why a treasure that she was given is buried. But that wasn't a problem in the Greek world, because Greeks practice necromancy, which doesn't mean reviving the dead. It just means it's a method of divination where you basically ask the dead and they give you responses. Think of the Witch of Endor in the Hebrew Bible, right? That's an example of necromancy, where the witch actually calls to the spirit of Samuel, and he comes from the underworld, essentially, and talks to Saul. Something similar. In the Greek world, there was a specific oracle which practiced necromancy, very famous in Thesprotia. And this is actually the oracle that Periandros asked. He asked the oracle to basically find out from his wife who was at the time already dead in the underworld, where the treasure is buried. Let's read the account. Periander had sent messengers to the Oracle of the Dead on the river Acheron in Thesprotia to inquire concerning a deposit, that's the treasure, that a friend had left to his wife. But Melissa, that's the name of the wife, which by the way means a bee in Greek, in an apparition said that she would tell him nothing. So the idea is that the messengers came to the oracle, and the apparition of Melissa, her specter, her I don't want to say ghost, appeared essentially, and she said that she's not going to tell anything, nor reveal where the deposit lie, for she was cold and naked. The garments, she said, with which Periander had buried with her, had never been burned, and were of no use to her. And the reason why I selected this passage is because it's a fascinating probe into the worldview of the people who formulated this kind of myth. I think this didn't happen. I don't think Periander actually even made the request, probably. I think this is mythology. It's just a mythology featuring people who existed. Like Periander was a real historical character, but I wouldn't think that this, like even the request was made, for example. And you can analyze the myth essentially, and you can maybe suss out why is it the case that it says the things that it says. But it's nevertheless, like even though this didn't happen, and no request was actually made, this is a really interesting probe into the worldview and into the thought processes of ancient Greeks. Because what's actually happening is that Periander buried her naked, and he buried her with some garments. But the problem is that the garments were not burned, which means that the apparition that was in the underworld was not able to use them. I guess the idea is that the body was cremated as well, and only the things that were cremated with the body sort of carried on into the afterworld so that the apparition could then use them. And because the clothes were not buried, she couldn't use them. So she just stayed naked, and she was cold in Hades, in the underworld. Then, as evidence for her husband that she spoke the truth, she added that Periander had put his loaves into a cold oven. This is an idiom for necrophilia. The idea is that the oracle had to verify that this is really Melissa speaking, and it's a literary trope in Greek literature that the way how oracles vouch for their own veracity is by providing a detail that they could not have possibly known. We have examples like this. Herodotus gives other examples. For example, Chrysos asks multiple oracles for something to tell him what he's going to be doing on a very specific day. And on that day, he purposely does something that nobody would guess, something really bizarre. And of course, all of the different oracles fail. Only Pythia in Delphi actually manages to correctly answer what it is that he's doing on that particular day. And that provides the verification. Here we basically have the same idea. The oracle is verifying that it's legit by providing the detail that nobody would know. And that's the detail that Periander put his loaves into a cold oven, which means that he violated that corpse of his wife. So when the message was brought back to Periander, for he had intercourse with the dead body of Melissa and knew her token for true, immediately after the message, he made a proclamation that all the Corinthian women should come out to the temple of Hera. They then came out as to a festival, wearing their most beautiful garments, and Periander set his guards there and stripped them all alike, ladies and serving women, and heaped all the clothes in a pit where, as he prayed to Melissa, he burned them. So what's happening now? Well, he's basically trying to make up for it, right? So his dead wife doesn't want to talk to him. I think we've all been there, and he's trying to right the wrong. He didn't bury her garments, so she doesn't have anything to wear in the afterworld. So he's basically overcompensating. He doesn't just burn one garment, he burns all the garments. So he decides to gather all the women, strip them naked, and burn all the clothes. And the idea is that as he's burning them and as he's praying to Melissa, he's essentially sending the clothes to the underworld so that she can wear them. They are burned, and that's the medium through which, that's the transportation method, essentially, how they get to the underworld. And we can see that this is going on also by the fact that he put the clothes in a pit. This is a chthonic sacrifice. Greeks essentially had a specific type of rites which were applicable to chthonic deities, which were connected to death and Hades and the afterworld, the afterlife, the underworld, and to the cult of the death of their ancestors, dead ancestors. And one of the features of this chthonic ritual was that, first of all, you sacrificed in a pit. You didn't sacrifice on an altar, which is above ground. You sacrificed in a pit, and there were specific pits which were discovered of this chthonic rite. And you usually sacrifice by burning. And what was also very important is that you burn the whole thing. Normally, when you sacrificed on altars, like food stuff, you would burn some of it, and then the rest of it you would eat. But when you're sacrificing to the spirits of the dead who live in the underworld, you would do this chthonic ritual, and you would sacrifice in a pit. That's another indication. So as you can see, this is a massive overcompensation, and it's one of the reasons why I would personally suspect that this is a historical passage, because it seems that this is showing a typical example of hubris, of a mortal person transgressing boundaries of what's acceptable for a mortal person to do. So here, he's basically massively overcompensating. And the point of the story is to show that this is not appropriate behavior. And these kinds of stories were told very often. They were usually told about heroes, who were usually fictional characters. So it seems to me that this kind of story was also transplanted to a guy who actually existed, probably because he was a tyrant. Okay, but that's not all of it. When he had done this and sent a second message, the ghost of Melissa told him where the deposit of a friend had been laid. So here it actually worked, and she gave him the information. So that's it. In case you have any burning questions, that would be it, right? There's going to be probably, unless my second daughter is born and I have to attend to other duties, there's probably going to be a stream next week, which is going to be about the Christians who invented the what was it that they invented? Oh, who invented the swoon theory, right? This is something that I was talking about last time, that basically in 19th century, particularly in Germany, among Protestant theologians, there was a large number of them who did believe in God, but they didn't believe in any miracles. So they were committed to explaining away all of the miracles in the Gospels naturalistically, but the one move that they specifically didn't make is the move of saying that what the Gospels describe is just fiction, invented fiction. They were committed to the idea that what the Gospels say is actually what people who were there at the time perceived. But of course, no actual miracles happened. So they had to explain it naturalistically. They had to explain the content of the Gospels naturalistically. They couldn't just say, oh, the story didn't happen. It's all made up. These were the Christians who were committed, for example, to the idea that there really were 2,000 pigs who suddenly decided to run off the cliff. They were committed to explaining it naturalistically, and they couldn't say it's just a made-up story. And of course, the reason why I want to talk about it is that the naturalistic explanations that they came up with are just hilarious. So I think it's going to be a riot. And of course, and they also had to, even though they were Christians, because they were committed to no actual miracles taking place, they had to come up with naturalistic explanations of the resurrection, and specifically of the resurrection account as it is in the Gospels. And one of the things that they came up with is the swoon theory. It's going to be a lot of fun, and one of the things that it's going to allow us to do, on top of having fun, is talk about some of the ways how discussing this kind of topic works, right? Because the point that I'm going to make, basically, to spoil it, is that it seems that a lot of the apologists today wish they were arguing against these kinds of people and not against us. They wish their opponents were committed to what is presented in the text being what real people in the first century experienced. And the thing that they hate the most is you telling them that what is actually recorded in the Gospels is just historical fiction. All right, so that's all for today. Thank you, and have a nice rest of the week.